My dear friends, the gospel that we have just heard has been heard by many young souls in generations gone by. One day, I suppose it would have been 1967, while studying history in my bedroom, I came across in the history book this verse. And I remember I was lying on the top bunk in my bedroom, and it was this verse which had fulminated St. Francis of Assisi. And with that fulmination, history, in a sense, for a large part of Europe, was altered. The power of Scripture on an open soul. And I remember that verse was so powerful in my head that I got down the steps of the bunk and knelt at the bunk of my brother and in some shape or form said to the Lord, I want to do that. And the way it worked out afterwards was, I suppose, the logical consequence, because at that stage, being an evangelical and anti-Catholic Baptist, it would have meant going that way. But once there's an openness, the Spirit can use contacts and other readings and other places and persons and graces to give greater illumination. But essentially, that was the issue, the will. And until the will gets to that point, the Lord can't get through. On the other hand, once he's got to that point, he's almighty. He can do anything. And St. Teresa of Avila gives that teaching at one point, that that is the state of soul that gives greatest glory to its Creator. The state of the will has got to the point of holy indifference. All I want is your minimum wish. Complete handing over of any preference at all. It's actually the point of sanctity, and it is the common element in all the saints, complete conformity of the will. That can work it out itself in any situation in life where providence puts ourselves, but it has to happen. And until it is happening, we are kidding ourselves. No matter how much we butter up the Lord with all kinds of incense and prayer, if it's not happening, we're still in command. So that's a point we can just look at quietly this evening. Are we doing it? Is there some unhanded over bit which is mine still? Now, as regards the concrete issue of discerning the will of God, because that is, after all, the theme of the Gospel, because this young man really wants to know what more. That is an issue. And this Gospel is actually the classic Gospel with regard to vocation. Do you notice how the answer the Lord gives is what applies to everyone? The moral code, not sinning. That is the minimum for getting there, to glory. And it's only when this other insistence comes out, the Lord goes further and gives what is precisely the verse given by those handling vocations. Actually, I remember it was quoted to me years later in France by the novice master. It was by then, I think, 1974, I can't remember, but it was a time when I'd gone for a month to France to live the monastic life, and the novice master would come out with key verses, often in Latin. Si vis, and he was emphasizing, si vis, if you want perfectus esse, to be perfect. In other words, that was the point. You can get saved outside. Si vis perfectus esse, if you want what has been called, even by Vatican II, in the Perfecte Caritatis of the Institutes of Perfection, perfect charity. again the will, because what is the organ of charity? The will. That then is a complete handing over of anything the Lord might ask, because to love completely presupposes that one follows through then with what he might be asking. But it's not easy, because if, as time goes on, one is led to a greater fullness and finds that the truth has to be in one of the churches which has the apostolic succession, therefore there's certain discernment going on there, because the Anglicans think they have it, and it's not clear because all the trimmings are there. I remember how I had to discuss this with the Benedictines, and how my spiritual father, when I was being instructed, had to explain to me that even my best friend was heading for the Anglican priesthood, and his father was already an Anglican clergyman, and his grandfather before him, even though they had all the trimmings, because they were high Anglicans, he had to explain to me, actually they haven't got it. And he was explaining why. He went into even the papal teaching on it, Leo XIII, and listening to a person of that academic calibre, a monk of Ampleforth, who'd been to Oxford, the way that without raising the voice, just step by step, indicating the why and wherefore of a whole question, nothing simplistic, just calmly explaining historically and theologically the issues, it was far more powerful than all the hot-headed arguments of high-powered evangelicals who do nothing but demolish, because I could see the difference. There was a calm, serene possession of a bulldozer of a truth which didn't depend on him to be defended. It had 20 centuries of history behind it, and one rested upon it without fuss or bother. It was so different from where I was coming from. But there was more. One day, while I was being instructed, he came and started off the instruction that week with, "Now, I've been talking to Don Kelly. We think it would be a good idea for you to go up to the monastery to Ampleforth, yes, for Easter, and see a bit of Benedictine splendour, yes, and meet the abbot." Of course, that was Basil Hume, he was no mean abbot. Yes, and of course, you see, the point was they knew that if you sent a person at 17 to a place where you've got 120 monks at Easter, and you see the maximum of Benedictine splendour, he'll come back with what? Well, yes, a vocation. And it actually works. Now, why am I saying all this? Something else was coming into play there, wasn't there? The other arm of God, his might and providence. Because the first was quite secret, it was on the level of the heart, something mystical, saying, hint, hint, this way, this way. You don't know everything yet, but you will, just one step at a time. As Newman in the same mess said in his prayer, one step enough for me. That other one then was the working out of that in coming to a place where you could be exposed again to the Lord in grace, sacramental, and also actually human, because the warmth of a good community does attract, because that's the best advert we've got. Charity outworked. And I remember, by the way, at the end of that Holy Week, coming from Ampleforth Abbey, they put me on a minibus of theirs and got me off then to the station at York. And as I waved to the novice master who had received me into the church and the community there with their cows and habits, that simple, good, English, kind goodness, I was actually nearly in tears. I thought, that's what I want. That goodness which is a reflection of God. And that's true vocational work, not programming. But anyway, to cut a long story short, things don't actually always work out as they might do, partly because sometimes we don't listen to those who know us best, because sometimes those closest to us know better than we do. And it's only with hindsight one realizes that. I remember actually one evening when I was about 19, I was washing the dishes, or drying them. Man was washing them and I was drying them, and we were talking to each other in Welsh. And she came out with this unexpected remark out of nowhere. She just said, "Well, look, if you're insistent upon coming, becoming a monk, you haven't thought of going to Ampleforth, have you? In other words, she was balanced enough to know that at least they would be caring and complete in their formation, whereas she knew that if you go to a different culture, France or whatever, you'll get something which you don't quite know. A mother sometimes knows more than the child, and it's only too late that we realise what we missed. However, all that to say, it's important that we take advice, because I remember the monks, they wouldn't say too much, but they would drop hints to the effect that be careful, because there's a huge difference when it comes to a different culture. It's not just a different language, there's a whole psychology. Because vocation, unfortunately, can be very complex. It can be mingled with much of the human, and a good divinely given vocation can be lost through human inadequacies, and sometimes, unfortunately, incompetence. I close that bracket, but it's not indifferent, because those who are in any way can in some way suscitate a vocation are extremely important at certain stages in a person's life. That can be your case as well. Another thing, God himself has his hands bound when it comes to vocations. He can't bless a place which is not doing his will. He can't honour a place which is not honouring him, because that actually is manipulating God. We can't have all kinds of wonderful vocational programmings going on and actually being in blatant disobedience with regard to the will of God, and that's going on. No, God is the author. But to do our bit, we have to do it, and he will honour that. Now, I want to attack one point this evening, it's this. When it comes in the last resort to discerning the will of God, and that applies to each one here, in any question which has to be addressed, and there are questions, discernment, there has to be a dynamic of receptivity. We are at the receiving end and not at the giving end. Otherwise, it's not actually divine in origin. Now, there's a lot of human stuff going on even in the church's life. Observe, just look around you. And God is not free to bless it. It might be the most spectacular liturgy on earth, but if it's in disobedience, God is not blessing it. We're honouring ourselves and our inventivity. God is being pushed out of his own. Now, there are places where heaven more easily meets earth. There are conditions where the voice of heaven, the still small voice, is perceived and heard. It was the case with Elijah, it's the case with any human soul, because essentially the human soul is always the same in its structure, and the same things function always. In our day, we are disadvantaged with regard to listening and hearing the word of God. Why? Look at your interior. Is it not true that your head is full of words? Go through your day. How many words are coming at you, even if you go to the shop? It's all words being pumped into your psyche, and therefore you are in a state of effervescence and rumbling, and you can't easily shed all that in 5 minutes. Therefore, prolonged silence is actually necessary to get into mode before we do anything serious. In the initial stages, letting go and still vibrating. By the way, that is also part of our problem in Ireland. Even our liturgy is very short. Therefore, we're just calming down. We've got to get out of church. And they're talking even in church, so it's not favouring. Now, I wanted to mention this element of therefore making up for it by creating or looking for spaces. Can you see where that is at your end? Do you recognise it? Where is it? Have a look. Can you see? Yeah? Come on, sister. No!
I can't see it, I'm sorry.
Ah.
Yes.
Kerry, you got it. You got it. Kerry, where is it?
Near Dingle.
It's. You got it. Who said that? Skellig Michael. And Ireland. Skelligs, but it's the big one, isn't it? And there you've got those beehive tubes, haven't you? Not beehive tubes, beehive cells. Still standing. But just think now, the utter silence you would have got in one of those cells. Now, the effort that was put into getting there, just think, took it seriously. Therefore, there aren't any shortcuts. We think we can get it just like that by having a quickie. Now, if we can't get it, we can make it. Every so often, going into a silent, and I mean a silent place, if possible with the Blessed Sacrament present, but sometimes it's actually even more important not to have any noise or communion with other people if one really wants to hear God. Because if one goes to a place, for instance, of adoration where there's noise, that's not much help, is it? Got the other person's problems going at you all the time. So the silence can perhaps at some times be more important for our soul, because the Lord is always present anyway. But if you can get the sacrament as well, all the better. If you get the two, that's perfect. Now, when that happens, the Lord then has access. But I want to attack one last point, it's this. He uses also human channels. Now, one day, I think it was the first time, always through this group, I got to Medjugorje in 1995. We were there, and it was the time when Eddie Stones was with us, therefore it was a very charismatic one. And we had one session of prayer and intercession in one of those old pavilions, those green things that were there in those early stages. And he was praying over us individually, as in those days he still would do in those days. Nowadays it's got so big that he can't do it. But he would then have a word, and he would see things, as you know, when he prays over people. And I remember, because I wasn't yet a priest, I'd finished part of the studies there, but I hadn't been ordained, and Cenacle was in a mess. And he looked and he prayed, and he could see a big black cross. Therefore there was a lot of pain ahead. You knew what happened in those days, don't you, in Cenacle? And then he saw, and this is the point, he saw a church, and he saw a door opening. Now, very shortly after that, a letter came from a friend saying, go to visit this monastery. And it was that church and door which Eddie Stone had seen. So I wrote to them, and they said, come immediately. And I went over to Italy, and Cenacle started making noises and so on, but they calmed them down, and more or less they took me in and just made it happen without any bother. Because being, as it were, supernatural, they were able to distinguish the level of importance of things. And they were also sufficiently orientated towards adoration, listening, and mental prayer. Now this is the point. The Lord was able to get through to them. Because there's a lot of human going on, even in discernment of spirits. A lot of good vocations are being ruled out by human prudence. And it's happening even now in screening, that sometimes the decisive word in vocational filtering is that not of the novice master or superior of the seminary or whatever, but of a team of psychological analysis going on before. In other words, human elements coming in of lay people who haven't got the charisma or even the vocation. That's extremely dicey. This to explain why also vocations are way down. Because good ones have been filtered out and weeded out. They've been looking for a certain type of vocation which fits into a mould, and that mould is not always the best. Be aware of these issues, because if you have to do with a potential vocation, it's important to send them where they're safe and where the right criteria are at work. So anyway, very shortly after getting there, remember the prior, he went off to have a good chat with the Archbishop, And being a good Italian as he was, he didn't even want to read the recommendation which came from my spiritual father. Oh, God, ordain him, yes, ordain him. So it was very quick, you see, because the Italians have their own way of doing things, which is a great blessing, because it can be extremely difficult sometimes when you've got all kinds of human elements coming in. What happened there? The other element, the divine arm of providence, was might as well as wisdom, and made what it wanted happen. So, last bit, there we were, years down the line, out there in Italy. Eventually novice master, handling the same thing with other people coming in. And we would take them in at 18 if we could get them, rather than down the line, because they were much more open to grace and uncontaminated. Eventually being taken off, being novice master, and therefore danger of being put in another situation, e.g. new parish work which they were taking on. What do we do about this? Exactly the same double element coming in. While quietly in prayer, just this whisper coming in. Don't forget Ireland. Don't forget Ireland. So, quick text to Ellen. What's the bishop's address? Next day, Bishop's House, Dublin Road, Mullingar, County Westmeath. Michael Smith. So, quick letter, knowing that every time the bishops are utterly negative, there's hope under creation. You think, Bishop, I mean, he's full of resistance, isn't he? By return of post. Oh, come along! I was amazed! A bishop who actually was on side. And again, divine providence and a bit of Irish common sense could see between the woodwork. Come this way. We'll sort you out without any fuss or bother. Because God